it's Red Effect, and today we will be comparing T-64 and M60. But since there are more variants of both tanks, I will be comparing T-64A to M60A1 and T-64B to M60A3, since each came out at a similar time as their counterpart. First, I will compare T-64A model 1971 and M60A1 AOS from 1972. Let's start with the protection. The armor of T-64A is very good, 410mm against APV-SDS on frontal glazes and 395mm on turret, and 450mm versus heat on both frontal glazes and turret. The protection is achieved with composite armor that incorporated aluminum filler, which significantly increased protection. T-64 is also known to be first tank to enter service with a composite armor. Now, the armor of M60A1 AOS isn't really that impressive. The turret front varies a lot. On one spot there is 230mm thick armor, and on one spot it's 127mm, and so on. The frontal upper glazes is 108mm thick. Considering the angles, the equivalency is around 220mm on upper glazes. The lower glazes, however, is thicker. It stands at 137mm, and considering the angles, it is around 300mm thick, which isn't that bad, but keep in mind, M60 does not have composite armor, so the figures are for both kinetic energy projectiles and high explosive anti-tank projectiles as well. Now let's talk about firepower. T-64A is armed with D81T 125mm smoothbore gun and can fire armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot, high explosive anti-tank and high explosive fragmentation projectiles. The best Soviet APV-SDS projectile of that time was 3BM-12 with 280mm penetration on 2 km, which was pretty enough to penetrate the M60A1. The heat projectile was 3VBK-10 with 450mm penetration and high explosive fragmentation 3VO-F36. M60A1 is armed with M68 105mm rifled gun and can fire armor-piercing discarding sabot, high explosive anti-tank and high explosive plastic projectiles. The best US APDS projectile of that time was M392A2 APDS with around 252-270mm penetration on 2 km, which isn't that much worse than the Soviet one, but it sure isn't enough to penetrate the T-64. The best heat round was M456 with 350-400mm penetration, which still isn't enough to penetrate the T-64. And the high explosive plastic projectile was M393, which has around 130mm penetration, but it isn't designed to destroy tanks with composite armor, but rather as an anti-infantry weapon and for lighter vehicles. Let's take a look at the mobility. T-64A has a 700 horsepower diesel engine with max speed of 60 km per hour and power-to-weight ratio of 18.4 horsepower per ton. The range of the tank is around 600 km without external fuel tanks. M60A1 has a 760 horsepower diesel engine with maximum speed of 50 km per hour and power-to-weight ratio of around 16 horsepower per ton. The range of the tank is around 500 km without external fuel tanks. That was a brief comparison of those two tanks. Now let's take a look at the later models, the T-64B and M60A3. The T-64B got an improvement of armor over the original T-64A. Instead of aluminum, corundum was added, but only in the turret. The frontal glazes remains unchanged. The armor of T-64B on the turret is 410mm versus APV-SDS and 500mm versus heat. The armor of M60A3 remains the same as on the M60A1. Now, the T-64B got equipped with two A46-2 125mm gun and the ability to fire Cobra ATGM from the main gun. Since T-64B is a later model, there are also new projectiles. The APFSDS for T-64B, that also came out in 1976, was a 3BM22, also known as Zaloga, and had 380mm penetration at 2 km, and the heat projectile was 3VBK-16 with 500mm penetration. High explosive fragmentation remained the same, and as previously mentioned, Cobra ATGM was added, which had 600mm penetration. M60A3 got upgraded from APDS to APFSDS. In 1978, when M60A3 entered service, M735 APFSDS was introduced, which had around 300mm penetration on 2 km. Other projectiles remained the same. It is also worth noting that both T-64B and M60A3 got ballistic computers and wind sensors when they were introduced. The mobility of both tanks remained relatively the same. Now, from this, it is easy to conclude that T-64 was a superior tank, but the problem is that until the late 70s the tank suffered reliability issues and was only reserved for elite troops, since it was very expensive and harder to train on than older tanks, since it was a big jump from tanks like T-55 and T-62. In 70s, the majority of the tanks in Soviet Union were still the T-62 tanks. M60, on the other hand, was meant to be a stopgap for M1 Abrams. US didn't really intend to keep it that long, so they kept upgrading the tank until M1 arrived in 1980. So the M60A3 remained the last variant of M60 series. But when M1 came out, Soviets already had a tank to be in par with it, the T-80. But that is a topic for another video. That is it, thanks for watching. If you think I made a mistake somewhere, feel free to correct me in the comment section down below. Check out my Discord channel or subscribe if you're new, and I will see you all in the next video. Have a nice day.